A circle of stone and rock sits 90 meters under the surface of the Baltic Sea, wider than half a football field, in water so dark that sunlight never reaches it. The pressure down there is strong enough to crush ordinary diving gear, and the cold alone can end a dive in minutes if a diver stays too long. Almost nobody alive has seen it in person. Only a handful of trained divers have ever touched its edge, and even they could only stay a few minutes before the cold and the pressure forced them back toward the surface. For more than a decade, the people who found it have tried to explain what it is, and every answer they give raises 3 new questions instead of closing the case. What happened next is still being argued about by scientists, journalists, and the very divers who found it in the first place, and almost nobody involved agrees on what it actually means. In June of 2011, a small Swedish salvage crew called Ocean X was running sonar sweeps across the Gulf of Bothnia, the narrow stretch of cold water that separates Sweden from Finland. The team, led by Peter Lindberg and Dennis Osberg, was not made up of scientists, geologists, or trained researchers. They were treasure hunters, plain and simple, and they earned a living finding old shipwrecks scattered across the northern Baltic and pulling up whatever cargo had survived the decades underwater. Most of what they found was ordinary. Bottles of vintage wine and champagne, still sealed after being trapped in cold, dark, low-oxygen water for a century, could sell for enormous sums to private collectors who wanted a piece of history in their glass. A few years earlier, Ocean X had located the wreck of a schooner called the Jönköping, a ship torpedoed by a German submarine during the First World War. That single find had made the crew minor celebrities back home in Sweden, well known enough that local newspapers had already profiled their work more than once before this expedition ever began. That earlier fame mattered more than it might seem, because when this same crew later reported something strange sitting on the seafloor, people were far more willing to take them seriously than they would have been for a random stranger waving around a sonar printout. The crew had spent more than a week on the water before anything unusual happened, running the same search patterns over and over across a stretch of seabed that had already produced almost nothing worth reporting. Fuel was running low, the weather had turned uncooperative more than once, and by most accounts on board, spirits were not particularly high. Nobody expected the final days of the trip to produce anything different from the first. On what was supposed to be one of the very last sweeps before the boat turned back toward shore, the sonar screen lit up with a shape none of the crew expected to see. It was round, roughly 60 meters across, sitting completely alone on an otherwise flat, mostly featureless seabed with nothing else like it for a considerable distance in any direction. Straight edges ran along parts of the outline, and to eye strained on shipwrecks and natural rock formations, those edges looked more like something built than something shaped purely by nature. Sections of the shape looked almost like steps, evenly spaced, closer to what you might expect on a staircase than anything a current or a glacier would carve into stone. Near the top of the shape sat what looked like 2 separate openings, one noticeably smaller than the other, with something resembling a squared-off frame built around the larger one. Behind the main body of the shape stretched a long, flattened scar cut into the mud, running for several hundred meters, as if something enormous had either been dragged across the bottom or had slid to a stop after a long and violent journey across the seafloor. The sonar image itself was far from perfect. It was blurry, low resolution, and grainy in the way that older sonar equipment often produced results, especially when scanning at awkward angles or through disturbed sediment. Even so, it was strange enough that nobody on the crew wanted to dismiss it on the spot. They saved the data, marked the coordinates, and quietly agreed among themselves that this particular find deserved a much closer look once they were back on land with better equipment, and ideally, some outside expertise. Word of the sonar image did not stay contained for long. Once the crew shared early details and a rough copy of the image with contacts back home, it spread across the internet with startling speed. Bloggers and internet forums got hold of it first, long before any major news outlet picked up the story, and it was there that the comparisons really took off. Someone online noted that the rounded shape, the straight edges, and the long trailing scar behind it looked uncannily like a crashed spaceship from a famous science fiction film franchise, and the nickname stuck almost instantly. Within days, people who had never followed ocean mysteries in their lives were repeating that same comparison, often without knowing anything else about the story at all. Tabloid newspapers picked it up soon after the online buzz built momentum, and once major outlets began running their own versions of events, the original sonar image had already been separated from any kind of careful, sober analysis. Headlines grew bolder with each retelling. Some articles openly speculated that the object might be the remains of a lost ancient civilization, swallowed by rising sea levels thousands of years ago, and preserved by cold water and low light ever since. Others leaned toward a very different explanation, suggesting the shape could be a hidden military installation left over from the Second World War, since the region had once been a heavily contested shipping corridor that both Axis and Allied forces fought hard to control during those years. A few writers pushed the theory even further, floating the idea of a secret Cold War-era submarine base built directly into the seafloor, hidden from satellites and surface patrols alike. And a smaller but louder group of commentators skipped the earthbound explanations entirely, insisting the object had fallen from the sky long before recorded history and had simply been waiting undiscovered ever since. None of these theories came from anyone who had actually examined the object up close, tested a single sample, or reviewed the raw sonar data with any technical rigor. They were guesses stacked on top of one imperfect image in a public audience that badly wanted something extraordinary to be true. Once those headlines existed in print and online, they proved almost impossible to fully walk back later, no matter what more careful research eventually turned up. Getting real answers required sending divers back down to the site to collect physical proof, but that return trip did not happen quickly, and the delay itself became part of the story. Ocean X simply did not have the money to fund a proper second expedition on their own. Diving to 90 meters safely requires specialized equipment, trained technical divers, support vessels, and a level of planning that a small commercial salvage outfit could not easily absorb out of pocket. Lining up sponsors willing to attach their name and their money to a story that much of the press had already turned into an internet punchline took nearly a full year of phone calls, pitch meetings, and polite rejections that mostly went nowhere. Lindbergh later admitted publicly that convincing serious backers to take the search seriously turned out to be far harder than finding the object itself had ever been. Investors and research organizations alike worried about being associated with a story that skeptics had already begun mocking online, and that reputational risk cost the team valuable time, while public interest in the mystery slowly cooled. Eventually, with help from a documentary production company willing to fund the trip in exchange for filming rights, Ocean X secured enough backing to plan a proper return expedition. In the summer of 2012, more than a year after the original discovery, the team sailed back out to the same coordinates in the Gulf of Bothnia, this time with a clear plan. They intended to dive as close to the formation as conditions allowed, collect physical rock and sediment samples for laboratory testing, document the site with better cameras than they had used the first time around, and finally settle the argument that had been raging online for months. Conditions at the site made that plan difficult from the very first attempt. Strong currents pushed against the dive team constantly, and visibility near the bottom dropped to almost nothing once sediment was disturbed, forcing divers to work largely by feeling near total darkness at depth. Getting close enough to the formation to gather anything useful took far longer than anyone on board had originally planned for, and every extra hour underwater burned through both precious bottom time and the limited budget the team had scraped together for the trip. Equipment had to be adjusted repeatedly to cope with the cold, and more than one planned dive had to be cut short or postponed entirely because conditions simply would not cooperate. Despite all of that, the team eventually managed to get divers close enough to the object to begin collecting samples directly from its surface and from the surrounding seabed. A milestone that felt like real progress after so many delays and so much public doubt. Once the team confirmed that the dive had actually gone better than expected and that usable samples were finally in hand, they treated the moment as a genuine turning point for the entire project. The first real physical evidence anyone would be able to test in a proper laboratory instead of arguing about a blurry picture online. That kind of milestone is exactly the sort of moment worth sticking around for if you want to see how all mystery like this actually gets tested against real science instead of speculation. So go ahead and hit subscribe right now. Because the next part of this story is where the evidence starts, talking back, and you will not want to miss how it holds up. What came out of that second expedition was not limited to rock samples. Divers on the trip also reported something far stranger happening around them while they worked, something that had nothing to do with geology at all. Crew members said cameras and communication equipment on board kept shutting down completely whenever their support boats sat directly above the formation, as if something at that exact location was interfering with the electronics. According to those same accounts, the equipment came back to life on its own once the boat moved a couple hundred meters away from the site, only to fail again almost immediately the moment they returned to the same spot above the object. Skeptics were quick to offer far more ordinary explanations for exactly that kind of failure. Saltwater corrosion, loose internal wiring, extreme cold at depth, and cheap or poorly maintained batteries can all cause cameras and communication gear to fail unpredictably at sea, with no unusual force required to explain any of it. No independent laboratory ever examined the failed equipment afterward and confirmed anything beyond ordinary technical trouble, and no controlled test was ever run to see whether the failures would repeat under monitored conditions. Even so, the claim spread everywhere once it reached the press, and it quickly became one of the most repeated details in the entire story, often mentioned before the actual rock samples were. Part of what made the claim stick so firmly in the public imagination was not the failing equipment itself, but who exactly was making the claim. Lindbergh had spent years building a public reputation as the most skeptical person on his own crew. someone who openly dismissed stories about strange ocean phenomena, ghost ships, and unexplained sonar readings long before this particular expedition ever began. He had said as much in interviews connected to earlier, far more mundane shipwreck discoveries. When even a longtime skeptic like Lindbergh admitted that the equipment failures near the formation were something he genuinely could not explain, that admission carried noticeably more weight with the public than an identical claim from someone with no track record of doubt behind them. News outlets leaned into that contrast heavily in their coverage, often framing the story around Lindbergh's apparent change in tone rather than around the physical evidence itself, since a former skeptic sounding uncertain made for a far more compelling headline than another unnamed source claiming something unusual had happened at sea. The rock and sediment samples the divers finally managed to bring back to the surface were sent to a geologist at a university in Sweden for proper laboratory analysis, and the results that came back were far less dramatic than the headlines had spent a year promising. Most of the material recovered from the site turned out to be ordinary granite, gneiss, and sandstone, common rock types found scattered throughout that entire stretch of the northern Baltic seafloor and hardly unusual for the region at all. One sample did stand out from the rest, a loose piece of basalt, a type of rock formed from cooled volcanic lava, which seemed genuinely unusual for an area with no known volcanic activity anywhere nearby. The geologist who examined the samples explained that this apparent contradiction was not actually as mysterious as it first sounded once the region's deeper history was taken into account. The entire northern Baltic had been reshaped dramatically by massive glaciers that melted and retreated thousands of years ago at the end of the last ice age, and glaciers are well documented to carry rock fragments enormous distances before eventually dropping them far from wherever they originally formed, a well-studied process geologists refer to as glacial transport. That exact process happens in glacial regions scattered across the entire planet, not just in this one stretch of Scandinavian sea, and it has been documented from northern Europe all the way to parts of North America, where similar out-of-place rocks turn up regularly. Other researchers who later reviewed the case independently noted that certain minerals found near the site, minerals that form naturally through slow chemical processes on ocean floors over very long periods of time, were present in exactly the amounts you would expect from an unremarkable stretch of seabed, rather than anything artificial or manufactured. That geological explanation should have quietly settled most of the public debate right there, and for a while it seemed like it might. But before that conclusion could fully take hold in the public conversation, a separate and unrelated group of outside scientists raised doubts about something even more fundamental than the rock samples, the original sonar image itself, the very piece of evidence that had started the entire story back in 2011. Researchers connected to a major American oceanographic research institution reviewed the original picture and reported that it contained a significant amount of distortion and interference, the kind of visual artifacts that commonly appear in lower quality sonar sweeps, especially ones captured at awkward angles or through disturbed sediment near the seafloor. These researchers argued publicly that a single blurry image, captured exactly once and never properly reshot afterward with newer, properly calibrated equipment, was never strong enough evidence on its own to support any firm conclusion in either direction, regardless of how convincing the shape looked at first glance to casual observers online. Other independent geologists who separately reviewed the detailed chemical composition of the collected samples largely agreed with that assessment, concluding that the material closely resembled ordinary seafloor rock, rather than anything deliberately shaped, cut, or manufactured by human or unknown hands. With both the original sonar image and the physical rock samples now facing legitimate scientific doubt from multiple independent directions, OceanX ran headfirst into a much bigger problem, one that had almost nothing to do with mystery and everything to do with plain economics. Serious deep-water research at that kind of depth requires expensive specialized equipment, dedicated research vessels, highly trained technical dive teams, and significant laboratory time, resources that universities and research institutions typically reserve for projects that already come with much stronger scientific justification behind them from the very beginning. OceanX, for all their earlier success finding shipwrecks, remained fundamentally a small commercial salvage outfit built around locating sunken cargo, not a research institution equipped or funded to solve open geological puzzles on its own. Their earlier expeditions had only been made possible in the first place through sponsorship deals and a documentary partnership tied directly to intense media attention, and once that public attention inevitably cooled down over time, comparable funding became almost impossible to find again. No matter how many interviews the crew gave or how many times they retold their story to journalists still curious about the case. A documentary released a few years after the initial discovery gave the team one more meaningful chance to lay out their full case publicly. Walking interested viewers carefully through every sonar image, every rock sample, and every equipment failure account one more time in a single organized presentation. But even that film failed to generate enough renewed interest or funding to launch another proper scientific expedition back to the site, and no major research team has returned to study the formation directly since that documentary aired. That left the formation sitting in a strange kind of limbo that persists to this day, too costly and logistically difficult for a small independent commercial team to investigate any further on their own, and simultaneously too far outside mainstream academic research priorities for any university or major research institute to take on, as aptly funded, serious scientific project of its own. Grant committees generally favor proposals tied to established research questions with clear scientific value, and a formation already tentatively explained by ordinary glacial processes rarely rises to the top of a competitive funding list, regardless of how much public curiosity it continues to generate online. Meanwhile, interest from the general public has never fully disappeared. The story resurfaces periodically on documentary channels, mystery-focused websites, and social media threads, usually presented with exactly the same handful of details each time: the sonar image, the equipment failures, and the eventual rock analysis, often stripped of the more nuanced scientific context that came later. Taken together, every piece of hard physical evidence collected from the site over the years points fairly consistently toward a natural explanation, rather than anything artificial. The recovered rocks closely match material scattered across the region by ancient retreating glaciers thousands of years ago. The unusual shape itself sits directly within an area that was heavily reshaped by massivist sheets during the last glacial period, a time when walls of ice far taller than any modern building slowly ground their way across this exact stretch of seafloor, carving and depositing material in patterns that can sometimes look surprisingly geometric from certain angles, once compressed into a single low-resolution sonar image. Outside experts who independently reviewed the original sonar data raised legitimate, well-reasoned doubts about exactly how much weight that single image could reasonably carry as proof of anything unusual happening at the site at all. None of that careful scientific work managed to stop the story from spreading rapidly across the globe in its early, more sensational form. And none of it fully explains why divers reported that their equipment failed specifically and repeatedly only when their boat sat directly above the site, and reportedly worked normally again everywhere else nearby, just a short distance away. Those particular claims about equipment failure were never independently confirmed under any kind of controlled scientific testing, but they were never fully disproven either, largely because no team equipped with the proper scientific resources and monitoring equipment ever went back to the site, specifically to test that narrower claim under carefully controlled conditions.